This is Books for Breakfast, a podcast where we talk about books and writing. I'm Enda Wiley.
And I'm Peter Sir.
And you're all very welcome to this morning's show. A beautiful tapestry of late middle-age reckoning. Well, today we interview the writer Mary Morrissy about her new collection of stories, 2020 Vision, just out from Lilliput Press.
The inside hadn't changed. The same polished oak, marble-top counter, partitions of dimpled glass, brass rail to lean your feet on, a snug in the front of the shop, a back room and a mirror behind the bar, so that even before you've got drunk, you're seeing double. The smell was just the same too, an oozing mix of stale porter and pungent urinal. I made my way through the outer bar to our spot in the long back room, under the big station clock, so you said we wouldn't be reminded of how little time we had. The relief of sinking into pub leatherette. I looked around furtively in case I'd expressed my ecstasy aloud, but even if I had, there was no one in the pub except for the bartender, a blocky, shaven-headed young man with his sleeves rolled up and nothing to do. Apart from him, the rest of the pub was unchanged. I sat in our corner gratefully and ordered a mineral water. A bald woman wearing a wig and throwing down vodkas alone at 4 p.m. would have seemed as big a cliché as our affair. The older married man and the youngish single woman trysting in a pub. These days I'm trying to avoid clichés, even age-appropriate ones. The electively bald barman landed the glass on the low table with a clink-clunk and obligingly opened the bottle and poured. I drank thirstily. The flinty taste of the carbonated waters set my teeth on edge. Funny aversions afflict you with chemo. I pushed the glass to one side where it spat effervescently, still trying to be the life and soul of the party. I confirmed the barman's suspicions that I was a mad old bat when I called him back and ordered coffee instead. It came in a thick cream catering cup slopping in the saucer. It was thin and bad from a jug stewed for hours, but it was like a Madeleine to our long-lost affair. With each sour sip, I was no longer visiting my past. I was right back in it. After treatment, most sensible people would go home and crawl into bed, but the last thing I want to do is to give in to sleep during the day. If I do, it means I'll be awake and alone in the graveyard hours. Ironically, I live alone, or should that be, I live alone ironically. I have made it a practice to call out, "Honey, I'm home," when I let myself in, as a joke to myself, on myself, and to puncture the squeamish silence of a house undisturbed since I left it. I tried to imagine the existence that would match my smooth and hearty greeting. The set of I Love Lucy comes to mind, a gleaming kitchen rich in appliances, a brave suburban light. Not my dim and overshadowed household. I use all the tricks of wolfish loners to combat solitude. I talk my way through tasks aloud. "Triana," I say, "time to sluice the tub," and so I set to, wiping down the surfaces, the tiles, the wash-hand basin, and colouring the bowl with a squirt of lemony liquid. And because I can never manage to keep the towel wrapped around me, and now my body geometry can't support it, I end up naked and sweating amidst the disinfectant fumes, the closest I get to a sexual glow these days. This was the time of day we used to meet. It annoyed me that you would arrive breathlessly, as if you were just managing to squeeze me in. But once you sat and calmed, we entered another time zone where all other preoccupations fell away. So absorbed would we become that a parade of our nearest and dearest could have passed by and we wouldn't have noticed. This place absolved us from being furtive. It was the only time we were not mindful of our situation, where it became just the pair of us, alone in the world. Perhaps that's why it was so intense. For an hour and a half, twice a week, we played ourselves. No wonder I hadn't wanted to come back. But as I sat there, I found myself soothed by the atmosphere, not haunted by it. In the torpor of an empty afternoon pub, I realised I'd found the perfect asylum for the chemically blasted.
And that was Mary Morrissy reading from Remission, from her new collection of stories called 2020 Vision, just published by Lilliput Press, already launched in Cork, and it's to be launched in Hodges Figgis in Dublin, Wednesday 26th of March at 6pm. Well, Mary Morrissy is one of Ireland's finest writers. She's the author of 4 novels, Mother of Pearl, The Pretender, The Rising of Bella Casey, and most recently Penelope Unbound. She has also published 2 collections of short stories, A Lazy Eye and Prosperity Drive. Her work has won her the Hennessy Prize and a Lannan Foundation Award. She's a journalist, she's a literary mentor and a teacher of creative writing. And today we are talking to Mary about her new collection of stories, 2020 Vision. And we're really delighted to have you, Mary, at the breakfast table. You're really, really welcome.
A kind of a general question to start with, Mary. I mean, you're a novelist as well as a short story writer. But could I just begin maybe by asking you, and I mentioned those 2 collections of stories already, but what draws you to the short story form?
Well, like a lot of writers, I started with the short story. There's this mistaken belief that it's easy. It's the easy form to start with, whereas in fact it's quite the opposite. It is a most demanding form. But on the other hand, you look at a writer like Alice Munro and you see what she can do with the form, and it's just really exciting, I think. And after the dark trenches of a novel, it's really nice to go back to writing in the short form, because you can see the light at the end of the tunnel, even if it's the oncoming train.
It was great to hear you read from Remission, a story I'd read before its publication in this collection. I think it was published in the Irish Times in the summer of 2023. And it really stayed with me, Mary, which I think is always a great sign of a great story. But without giving away too much, this story isn't just about somebody thinking back to a love affair that ended. Something else happens in the story. Someone enters the pub. The narrative shifts surprisingly. When you write a story like Remission, has that inventive turn always been planned? Or does it just surprise you as a writer as much as it surprises us as readers?
Well, in that story, it really did surprise me, because I thought I was just writing a sort of a vaguely nostalgic piece about a woman remembering a love affair of many years previously. Mm-hmm. And when she steps into this pub, somebody enters the scene and she finds herself not only remembering the affair, but being sort of pitched right back into the middle of it. And then this person who has triggered all of these memories actually has an active part in the story. And I didn't anticipate that. But in fact, I felt that it gave the story suddenly a kind of friction that it didn't have before. I was a bit alarmed when suddenly this man had a speaking part, which I wasn't really anticipating. But I think it brings the whole story into a kind of a contemporary situation, and dramatises it, so it isn't just reminiscence. It's reminiscence with an edge to it.
Yeah, that's exactly what it was. I really enjoyed that story. It was really excellent.
The stories stand alone. I know there's 3 of them that have the same characters, but the stories in general, they're connected together often by there's themes of maybe late middle age, regrets, and there's love's loss, and there's buried secrets, and there's kind of late life perspectives that unearth difficult truths. And I just wonder, again, did you set out to make these connections, or did they all just unfold organically?
Well, the way it is with short stories, it's very rarely one sort of bout of inspiration. It's an accretion of work. So, at the end of 2022, I gathered all the stories I'd written over the past 6 or 8 years since my last collection. And I suddenly thought, there's a collection. There's a collection's worth here, whether there's a collection here or not. And, then I began to sort of go through them with a beadier eye and I began to see that there was quite a few of the stories which were from this perspective of late middle age, looking back with regret and remorse. And, I am at that stage myself. And, a great deal of your thinking is involved with seeing the patterns and seeing mistakes that you've made, or seeing good things you've done too. And so I shaved an awful lot of stories out of it that actually didn't fit. And so, in fact, the theme came from really organically from the stories rather than me imposing a theme on them. And as I say, I wrote them all separately. I mean, I didn't intend them to be collected together. But because I was looking at them in 2022, of course, COVID had happened. And I just feel, particularly with the short form, the short story seems to me like literary news from the front, and that it would be absolutely ridiculous and absurd not to acknowledge that COVID had happened, to write about characters solely as if COVID had never happened just seemed ridiculous. So I thought, I wonder what's happened to, X character since COVID. How has COVID changed them? So that's where the kind of the repeat stories, the revisiting came in. So that's why there are some stories with the same characters appearing either in main form or fleetingly in the background.
Yeah, which is great. I thought it was great, all those connections. Your characters can often seem pretty cruel too. I'm thinking of Dom, who's been given very little time to live in the story, Seize the Day, and without giving away too much, an old college girlfriend of his, Cora, appears in the house, and it's troubling and it's hurtful for Rosalie, the wife. So betrayal, the hurts we inflict on those we supposedly love or have loved, is evident in this story and throughout the collection too. And I'm thinking of Lost Property, where Carmel opts for quite a cruel way to dispose of her dead husband's ashes. Do you think people are quite ruthless, Mary, or do these kind of characters just appeal to the writer in you?
There's a question. I think, as you put your finger on it, there's a lot of betrayal in these stories, people betraying one another. And, the longer you live, the more option you have for betraying people. And, betrayal is cruel, no matter what form it takes. And particularly, say, with a character like Carmel, who in the first story, sort of pre-COVID, is sort of benign, although she's angry with her husband. But, over the space of the pandemic, that feeling hardens into something quite cruel and vengeful, until, in fact, she has a kind of comeuppance of her own. She's suddenly faced with her own involvement in activities of her husband's, let's put it like that, so that, she sees that she is also implicated in the choices he made.
And I'm thinking also of a story like Fingerpost, when we read about what Delma really thinks about her friend. And then Christine decides to do something quite cruel at the end as well, doesn't she? She makes a decision. So it's those kind of cruel acts by people that you think, they've been long time friends for life. But home truths come out, don't they?
Yes, and in that story, the two women also have been cruel to Christine's husband. They have conspired to betray him, even though it's in Delma's case, it's kind of quite a small betrayal. She just keeps a confidence that perhaps she shouldn't have, but nobody escapes the betrayal trope, I think, in these stories.
That's right.
Yeah, I mean, certain things come up again and again. I mean, certain themes, I suppose. I mean, kind of children lost, children separated from parents, characters longing for children. And in Dundee, for instance, Eva, a young au pair, she's besotted by the two little twins. And by marrying Lar, who's a widower, she kind of happens to get him into the bargain. Or motherhood, again, is touched on in other stories like Remission and Repossession and Notes on Biology or Onset. So children and mothers in various forms kind of run through the collection too, don't they?
Yes. I mean, I think it's a preoccupation. Well, it's a preoccupation for women, whether you have children or you don't, as I don't. There's always that notion of, what would it be like, to be in the other state, to have children or not to have children. And, fiction is all about speculation, really. It's living the life you didn't choose.
That's interesting. Characters in these stories, Mary, are often on shaky ground, aren't they? Emotionally, they might feel lonely, disconnected from their supposed friends and family. And reading them, I was also wondering, can we trust their perspectives on the world? Can we really trust Mary, for instance, in the story Kiss of Life, where she's convinced her best friend Jane is in love with her husband Derek? And Mary's suspicions are all rooted in an instant where her husband saves Jane at the beginning of the story from being choked by giving her a Heimlich manoeuvre. It's a very inventive start to a story. And we interviewed John Banville recently, and he said that all his characters are really him. So while not at all assuming that your characters are you, Mary, I am wondering, do real life occurrences inspire you to write a story? Is fiction for you a reinvention of life?
Well, sometimes an event can spark a story. And in fact, a real event sparked that story. I was the cook. I was having a dinner party with a couple of friends of mine, one a very old friend of mine, and she choked on my dinner.
Oh
and,
my God,
and someone else
Mary.
did the Heimlich manoeuvre. And I had to run this story by her because she has a husband. I was saying, this is just the event has sparked the story. The rest of it is completely my tortured invention.
And did she mind?
No,
mind,
she
Mary?
didn't. Yeah, she writes
that's
herself, so I
fun.
think she understood, the instinct to use everything as material, But it was so dramatic, and it was that feeling that, death had entered the room, and thankfully death retreated again. But it was that moment where 1 minute we're all having a jolly dinner party, and the next minute one of us could be dead, and it seemed to me a dramatic sort of representation of, look, the state we're all in, any of us could go at any moment,
So the answer was the Heimlich manoeuvre.
The answer was the Heimlich manoeuvre. But also, I wanted her to be unreliable, in the sense that the reader's thinking, is there something going on? Is it all her imagination? Because I think, this is the way our brains work, we're constantly wondering, are we right? Are we mistaken? And can we trust people? Can we trust our own feelings? And I think that's what she's going through.
Yeah, well, you definitely achieved that in that story. When we get past things that she has done as well. But I don't want to give away too much. But I think it's again a really powerful story, and it stayed with me. So it's interesting.
Makes me feel like I need to go and relearn the Heimlich manoeuvre as well. Actually,
I know it's making me scared about having dinner parties.
I know, because we're planning to have a big dinner on Monday. I'm getting a bit scared now.
Exactly, I'll talk you through it.
Yeah,
we'll have to look up the
Yeah, we will.
We'll ring Mary. Mary will sort it all out.
Mary, you trained as a journalist, and you've worked as a reporter, feature writer, sub-editor, all these experiences which are also described in the final story of the collection, Curriculum Vitae. And you're also a critic. You've reviewed fiction for the Irish Times, Sunday Business Post, the Dublin Review of Books, for instance. I just wonder, did that work as a journalist and sub-editor feed into your development as a writer? I mean, were you always writing while being a journalist, and what made you take the leap and become a full-time creative writer as such?
Well, the writing actually came first. I mean, I started writing very young, in my teens, and then I trained to be a journalist, and for a long time I saw them as being quite competing with one another. Particularly as a reporter, I found it quite hard to, spend the day writing, and then going home and writing in another mode. So quite early on, I moved into editing. I moved into subbing and copy editing, which I found was, more conducive. So you just spent your days, sort of hacking through other people's efforts and then going home and creating yourself. But, it created a kind of a nice distinction, while still having all the excitements and the camaraderie of the journalistic life, So, I mean, I really liked journalism and found it inspiring in the sense that, first of all, it's very good training for being a writer. You know about deadlines. The deadlines have to be honoured. You're used to sitting down and doing an 800-word sprint. So you've got it. It's in your DNA, and that makes facing the blank page a little bit easier. On the other hand, it's a terrible drawback in terms of it fools you. Training as a journalist fools you into thinking, I can do this, it's just a different kind of writing. And in fact, you really have to unlearn everything you've been trained as a journalist when you start writing fiction, because you're talking about a completely different set of writing principles. So you have the facility and you have the familiarity with the writing process, but you have to learn a whole new set of rules.
Yeah, I'd say you met many interesting characters, Mary, that fed into stories.
Yes, and the other thing is that journalism teaches you to recognise a story. You see little nuggets of wisdom, stuck away in small little stories, just a passing remark. Or we used to run these tiny little paragraph stories, running down the side of a page in the Irish press, and you'd find just tiny little stories there, and you think, like there's something there,
Yeah,
so it was very inspiring from that point of view too.
Mary, I love ghost stories, and one story really stood out for me for its otherworldliness. And Roald Dahl said that in the best of ghost stories, the ghost never appears, but in Repossession, a story of yours, a ghost does appear. So it breaks that rule, but it absolutely spooked me in your story. How did this idea come to you? Do you love ghost stories too? And was this hard to write, to create such a scary, disorientating atmosphere within the confines of a story?
Well, actually, the idea of that story came from teaching. I spent quite a while teaching, particularly in the MA in creative writing in UCC. And I was doing ghost stories with undergraduates, so I started reading quite a lot of ghost stories. There was a wonderful story by Rose Tremaine, and I won't be able to remember the name of it. And it was in this book of ideas from Henry James's notebooks. So various writers were given Henry James's notebooks of ideas, and these were ideas which he actually never wrote himself. And Rose Tremaine picked some notion of James and wrote a story about it. And in it, it's about two women living side by side, and you're never sure, is the woman next door a creature of the narrator's imagination? Is it a ghost? And it just intrigued me that she was able to create this seemingly realistic story, and yet at the end you're scratching your head saying, is the narrator mad? Is there really a ghost? Is there even another person? Or is this two sides of the one person? So that kind of inspired me to write that story. And again, a bit like Marie and the other story, I wanted to create the doubt in the reader's mind. Is this woman who has she imagined this other woman coming and taking over her house and throwing her out? And because the house has been bought under sort of dubious circumstances, in that it's a bank, the bank has taken the house over because the people who owned it previously couldn't pay their mortgage. So the woman in the story is very conflicted about this, about moving in. So that's its repossession. And is this woman who repossesses her house, or is it just possesses her mind, the woman that she dispossessed by moving into that house? So I really wanted to explore also that notion of, the ethics, this sounds very grand, but the ethics of, capitalism, essentially, and, that notion that if you benefit from someone else's misfortune, can you absolve yourself from that?
That leads me kind of nicely into my next question, actually, which is, your last collection was called Prosperity Drive, and all the stories were located on a particular suburban street. But here in 2020 Vision, there's lots of property too. We've just been talking about repossession, and there's Carmen, for instance, the red brick Victorian house in the story Property. There's the glazed penthouse in the same story that she's forced to live in now, and which she despises. There's another story, Lost Property. We see Carmel again as a hungry reader of property supplements, lusting after Litchfield Cottage in its Strawberry Hill Gothic style. So there's a sense of place, but also actual properties is very important in these stories. I just wonder, is property and the fascination of property somehow kind of part of the Irish psyche, do you think? Because we're just constantly bombarded with stories about property and housing. It's the first item on the news almost every morning.
Yes, well, partly it's a bit of one of my addictions. Is I'm into property porn. I watch all those people over redoing their houses, and House of the Year, I'll be there. So partly every story, John Banville is right, every story is really about me. So that's
it's all
my
coming
preoccupation.
Out now.
It happens, I think, though, to mirror many people's preoccupation. And the other thing about the age of a lot of these narrators is they are all property owners, and not only are they property owners, but they're property owners several times over, and the houses are actually part of their characters in a way, speak to their characters, so that Carmel's relationship to her family home is the thing that actually spurs all her bitterness and resentment, because her husband is made bankrupt and she's forced to leave this house, which wasn't just a house to her. Like, she's appalled because her husband says it's like an asset, so we can get rid of it. But to her, it's not an asset. It's, her entire life, her entire soul is tied up in this place. So it's more complicated, I think, than, just my property addiction.
It's a collection that's skillfully interwoven, as you said. We've spoken about recurring themes like property just there, and different themes, children, but there's also characters that appear again and again throughout the stories, and we see them at different stages in their lives, some of them anyway. And Bernard is a particular favourite of mine. In Heartburn, we see him as a young man who visits his German pen pal Greta in Hamburg, and he sent her a photo of his better looking brother, and she's actually as a result quite shocked to see him in the flesh. And Peter, sorry to interrupt talking about 2020 Vision, but Peter has a story to tell which is quite relevant to this story, Mary.
Well, no, it just reminded me, because I had when I was about 14, I had a kind of burning passion for a girl in somewhere in East Germany. Magda, as far as I remember, was her name, and we wrote. I wrote pen letters, so we were pen pals. And at a certain point in the relationship, she said to me, Peter, can you send me a photograph? And because that hadn't happened, so I sent her a photograph of my 14-year-old self. And the sad thing is that I've never heard from her. I never heard from her again. And I just wish I had thought of I don't have an older brother, so I couldn't have sent my older brother's photo, but I should have cut out a photo of somebody else and sent it to her, and that might have, but there she's so wandering around somewhere in Germany now as my former.
Poor Magda and poor Peter. That is a heartburn, Peter.
That is.
Anyway, Peter, thanks for that. But we'll get back to Bernard now. So he experiences in Hamburg a surprising romantic interlude that sustains him for 4 decades. And then fast forward to the end of the collection, and we see him again later in life in the stories Wait and Mature People. Was Bernard a character you liked too, Mary? And I think you kind of enjoyed returning to him again and again, did you?
I did. In fact, there's that story, Wait, which is about Bernard going off on a trip of a lifetime to China. That was my first story about Bernard. And, one of the things over COVID is that I have been, dabbling in flash fiction. So that started as a very short story about Bernard. And there was something about him that I thought, I'd like to develop this more. And so then I wrote Heartburn, which is about him as a very young, a teenager essentially. And he already, in the first story, he has a kind of a friendship stroke relationship with Olivia, who's kind of a foil for him. And I suppose I kind of wanted to see what he was like as a younger person, Where did this older, more rueful character come from?
That exquisite discomfort of the stay in the German, it's just that he's there, and from the moment he's picked up on the train and by the horrified pen pal to the whole thing of the stay with the mother and the father. I mean, it's strange kind of everything about that story is just...
I know.
The hairs kind of stand up on your neck with just the discomfort of it all.
Yeah, but it's also very funny, Peter. I was
of course,
smiling my way, laughing my way through it as well. But then it is sad as well at the end. But I was delighted to see him at the end of the collection as well.
Because he preserves the letter, the farewell note from the mother all his life.
Yeah.
They have a bit of a thing where they have a dance, but...
I know, but there he is with Olivia as well, carrying the flame for her as well.
Yeah,
Yeah, he's a very interesting character. But it's time to end this part of the conversation now, because we'd love to hear you read an excerpt from Heartburn, if you could, Mary. Also, Mary, did you tell me at one stage that this story was also a story that you heard from somebody else? Is that true? Or, yeah.
Yes. This, the bones of the story was a friend of mine who went to Germany and, had not quite this kind of connection, but he arrived home to his pen pal's mother's house, and the mother asked him to dance, and he was like a bit taken aback, and wasn't quite sure, what was going on. And, he's a man of my age, so he said, even now I really don't understand what that was all about. And I thought it was interesting that after all these years, he still had that sort of sense of bafflement that he had at that age as to what were the dynamics here that he just didn't understand. Yeah. So, I had to get his permission to write about this too. Yes. And he very generously said, yes, you may. And even though, as I say, I have taken liberties with his story.
But it's so interesting that you then, another person took his story and in a way untangled that bafflement, and tried to get to the essence of it. So he must have been grateful to you in a way.
Well, he said to me, it's so strange to see this reproduced. It's sort of an echo of my experience. It's the same, but it's different, completely different.
Yeah, so interesting.
And I suppose that's the power of fiction, that it can do that kind of transforming thing while holding on to the nub of the truth of the original story.
Yeah. So we'd love to hear it now, Mary, if you want to read a piece.
Nothing happened, he told Olivia when she winkled the story out of him 30 years later. She was inordinately pleased to discover what she called a Mrs. Robinson episode in his past. Olivia was always convinced he was withholding on her. He'd never gone as far as telling her he was a virgin. She wouldn't believe him, he was sure. It wasn't a credible thing to be in this day and age. He was a fat, middle-aged man living with his brother, a defrocked priest, although Gerard insisted he'd left the priesthood of his own volition in the house they'd grown up in. That was enough of a social handicap to bear. It told most people all they wanted to know. Declaring the extent of his sexual innocence would have been a burden. For Olivia, that is. Nothing happened, he repeated, as Olivia wiggled her eyebrows at him like a smutty comedian. He didn't describe the nesting sensation of Mutty in his arms, the animal closeness of another body, the trustingness of her. Not a bit like Auntie Min, who taught him to dance, who was vibrant and lipstick and smoked a cigarette as she swung around the sitting room in green silk, while imperiously pushing and pulling him about the place like some jousting bully. There was initially some awkwardness with Mutty, which hand went where, etc. Because of his age, she expected him only capable of that modern shuffle business, arms at waist level, gripping your partner's love handles. But he didn't want that, because he was afraid of how his own body might react to such frictive proximity. So he placed a hand firmly in the small of her back and took the lead. She was quite solid in his arms. He discovered comforting little rolls of flesh under her armpits that felt like baby fat. And when he looked down, he was a good foot taller than her, he could see fair down on her cheeks. She complied, surrendered. She knew most of the steps too, although he could tell it was a while since she'd danced. When she'd forget or stumble, she'd look up and smile, but otherwise their bodies did the talking. Even as Bernard shimmied and jived with Mutty, he knew her loneliness was more intense than his, but it chimed with what he felt was his deep unlovability. After a while he forgot he was dancing with his pen pal's mother, and he believed she forgot that he was the soft, pouchy boy her daughter had brought home. That was the joy of it. They forgot themselves. He recognised several tracks, A Man and a Woman, Fly Me to the Moon, What Now, My Love, from Hospital Requests, which his mother liked to listen to, though she didn't care much for James last. James Blast, more like, she said. Mutty was turning the record for a second time when they heard Greta's key in the door. She dropped the needle noisily on the vinyl and tamped down her hair, then wordlessly she went to her end of the sofa, he to his. She patted her cheeks with her palms while he tried to regulate his breathing. When Greta peered around the door, they were sitting as stiffly together as when they'd started. The lush strings of Lara's theme filled the room. "Oh, Mutty," Greta said in English for his benefit, "Bernard is not liking this altmodish music." Bernard found himself bristling. What did Greta know about him? Nothing. His letters to her in his stilted German allowed only the tedious cataloguing of activities, much of them invented, and he found himself tongue-tied in her presence, all his paltry learning deserting him. She crossed the room and pulled the needle roughly off the record. Behind her back, Mutty looked at him, shrugged ruefully and smiled. Greta turned the TV back on. "Ein Platz an der Sonne," a hectic TV voice declared with matching words on screen. A flashing starburst showed a large sum in Deutschmarks. "This," Greta explained patiently, "is our game of chance." A lottery, Bernard had already guessed.
Oh, thank you, Mary Morrissey. So that was Mary Morrissey. If you want to know what it's like to dance with your pen pal's mother, read that story, Heartburn. It's from 2020 Vision, a new collection of stories by Mary Morrissey, just published by Lilliput Press. And Mary, we cannot let you go without asking you to take part in our Toaster Challenge, where you're going to talk about a book that you really love for as long as it takes to make a slice of toast. And I have to say, when we were in communication with Mary, I forgot to mention the Toaster Challenge, and then Mary came back and said, "But can I do it?" So she really does want to do it. So the bread is ready. Peter is putting it down.
Here we go.
And here you go, Mary, off you go. The book I've chosen is The Transit of Venus by Shirley Hazard, who's an Australian writer, and this book dates back to the 1980s. And it's a book that I revisit a lot of the time, and I don't reread books a lot because there's always too many new books to read. And I don't always read it completely all the way through, but I dip into it, mostly because of the beautiful prose. Shirley Hazard writes like a dream. She writes like a poet, in fact. And it's a story of two Australian sisters who come to England post-war, and it's really a romantic story. It's romantic in its intentions, and it's about their lives and their loves, their marriages, their widowhoods, love and betrayal, of course. And it's just a beautifully arranged book because it's called The Transit of Venus. The patterns in it are very similar to the patterns of the planets. Now, this might sound very highfalutin, and it's not. You know, it's just woven into the story, so you're barely aware of it. She writes in a beautiful, painterly way. The opening of the novel, which is about a man walking in a thunderstorm, is like a painting. It's described like a painting, even though it's full of electricity, both romantic and literal. And as I say, it's romantic in its intentions and was probably very unfashionable when it came out in the 80s, and it's probably even more unfashionable now. But it is a total treat. And, you know, if I can quote John Banville, who says, you know, that prose writers, you know, are allowed to write poetically, and, you know, the only difference is that our lines go out to the end of the page. And this is, you know, beautiful language. And there's often a kind of a sniffiness about, you know, sentences that advertise themselves or do a little pirouette and ask you to admire them. But Hazard's language is really, you know, part of the story. It wouldn't be half so interesting if she didn't write in the beautiful way that she does.
So I think that was great, Mary, and the toast is not burnt at all. In fact, I had spoken about this very same book and raved about it many podcasts ago. So it's great to hear you talk about it as well. I always called her Shirley Hazard, but Hazard sounds much more exotic.
I had no idea how she actually pronounces her name.
And speaking of John Banville, like he described the transit of Venus as intricately plotted and gorgeously written, which is what you were talking about there as well. He also said something interesting. He said, there's a peculiar and powerful sense of evil hanging over the narrative, so that even as one is impelled towards the conclusion, one is at the same time fearful of getting there. So it's interesting, but it's a fantastic book.
Yes. And I think the other thing is the mastery of that opening scene, which is beautiful and painterly and lush, and yet all of the seeds of the story, including the kind of the rather sad ending of one of the characters, is included there. But you're so distracted by this wonderful prose that you don't actually see those little breadcrumbs that she leaves until the very end. And then you think, you know, so it has that quality of a kind of almost like a thriller, you know, that you think, oh, she told us this was going to happen, but we didn't recognise it.
Thanks for that, Mary, and thanks too for talking to us about your new collection of stories, 2020 Vision, which is just published by Lilliput Press. And details of the book will be available on booksforbreakfast.buzzsprout.com, as will details of Shirley Hazard. So if you want to hear Mary, she will be launching this new collection at Hodges and Figgis, Wednesday the 26th of March at 6 p.m. So Mary Morrissy, thank you so much again for dropping in for breakfast this morning.
Thank you for inviting me. It's been great.
I think we've reached the end of our Books for Breakfast podcast this morning. I'm definitely rushing off to have more coffee. And I'm Enda Wiley, and I have Peter Sarah here with me. And Peter, would you like to tell everyone about the details of the podcast if they'd like to listen again?
Well, you can subscribe at all the usual sources, Google and Apple and so on. And if you want to check out the notes that go along with this podcast, you can go to booksforbreakfast.buzzsprout.com. And so
we'll be back again. We'll have the toast on, we'll have the kettle boiling, we will have more books to discuss, and we're looking forward to having you here. So goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye.